What does the leadership team actually believe about operational excellence? Do they believe it's part of our DNA? It's what we do, which is what it should be? Or do they think it's just this thing off to the side and we can,
Yeah.
those guys, those CI
Yeah.
guys can do that, that group can handle it. If they think of it that way, that will not work. I've seen successes using different terminologies and different tools, and that's fine. The commonality, like I said, is having this consistent problem-solving process, having the right culture. And one thing I didn't mention is having true leadership engagement, not just lip service to it, but actual ownership.
Welcome to KPI Fireside. Our mission is simple: to improve companies and to improve careers through continuous improvement. In every episode, we explore the spark, the moment, the mindset, or the method that ignites real change. Whether you're just starting out or leveling up, you'll find the insights and inspiration to fuel your next improvement. Welcome back to KPI Fireside, a continuous improvement podcast. I am your host, Keith Norris. Our guest today is Darren Dolcemascolo. Darren is the founder of EMS Consulting Group and has spent more than 2 decades helping organizations improve operational performance through Lean Six Sigma, leadership development, and execution-focused consulting. His work today focuses on helping leaders move beyond tools and improvement activity to build the operating discipline needed for measurable, sustainable results. And for listeners of the podcast, Darren has been here once before, back on episode 31. So if you like what you hear today, you can go back and get a little bit more of the conversation with Darren on episode 31. Darren, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. It's great to be back. I had a great time the first time, and I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, awesome. It's great to have you back again. I had some wonderful feedback on our previous conversations. Yeah, excited to to get into it again here today. So, it's a bit of a tradition to ask folks how they got started, the spark with continuous improvement. I know you've previously answered that question, but for anybody that might not have heard that episode, tell us again, where did you first get the bitten by the bug to get involved in this continuous improvement discipline?
Well, yes, the first time I got into CI was actually during college, believe it or not. I studied industrial engineering and operations research, and there was a required project, a senior project, and it was a consulting project, and it was a continuous improvement type of consulting, industrial engineering type of consulting. And once I did that project, I had a real interest in that type of work. And even before that, just getting into industrial engineering, that excited me. That's really where my continuous improvement or operational excellence kind of started, even though at that time they didn't call it that. It was just industrial engineering. And ever since then, I've really been involved in the operational excellence world. So it's been a long, long time.
You mentioned Lean and Six Sigma, and I know some people think of Lean Six Sigma as like a very specific thing. And yes, some people are like all in 100%, using the Japanese term and everything. But I think it's important for people to realize that business improvement is a really broad swath of methodologies. And I know, Darren, that you feel the same way, that there's different words to use to describe some of the same concepts. What are some of the whether people are using the Japanese Lean Six Sigma, but what are some other terms that people might use to realize, okay, this is a business improvement problem that I have, or a continuous improvement problem that I have?
So, for example, you might find some purists saying, well, we need to use all of this kind of vocabulary of Japanese terms like Kaizen, Kanban as a specific tool. You can Hijunka, all of these different Japanese terms. And it's very important to use these according to some people. And you'll have these sort of wars about this. In fact, I know before the podcast, we were talking about LinkedIn a little bit. If you go on LinkedIn, you can find arguments and, people that are real purists about these things arguing back and forth about that. But when we talk about continuous improvement, operational excellence, even the discipline of industrial engineering, there are all of these terms. But what's really important is how we actually use the methodology of what we're using. Like last time, we talked a lot about problem solving, and we need the discipline to use that problem solving methodology. That's really important, how we think. And then what tools we use is also important, but the naming of them and whether we use the Japanese terms and spell them correctly, I see arguments about that as well, to me is just so unimportant. You will not find me engaged in any of those debates on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Sometimes I read them for humor purposes, but I don't really find that necessary. I think what we really need to do is look at the business problem, have a disciplined process, problem solving process. And whether we use DMAIC if we're Six Sigma people, or we use Toyota 8-step problem solving process or something in between, it really doesn't matter as long as it's a disciplined process that we follow and we use that thinking, we're going to be successful. So the terminologies and those sorts of things, to me, I'm not a purist about it. To me, some people treat it as though it's a religion. It's got this, you have to follow this, use these terms. And to me, that's crazy, because the goal is better business outcome. And we achieve that through the way we think, the kind of culture we create in the company, all of these things. But the terminology is not all that important. And a lot of times I work within kind of the culture of the company, right? Maybe the company already has some of this in place and they want help. I'll work with that, because that's not what's important. It's not like, well, now I need to change your mind. Start using these Japanese terms instead. And, to me, that isn't unimportant. It's not a very important at all.
I guess what I'm hearing a little bit is I'm kind of picturing somebody who speaks multiple languages. If like you go to France and you need to speak French, and you go to Spain and you need to speak Spanish. If you go to somebody who's speaking, the Japanese Lean Six Sigma, like Darren can speak that. If you've got somebody who's, trained in a different methodology, but you're able to translate between the terms. I guess the thing that I've also have heard is that it doesn't so much matter which of those languages you adopt inside your own company, but having a language that is shared and a process that is shared is probably the more important part of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's it. I mean, part of what we try to do with clients is to get everyone speaking the same language. And that's not Japanese terms, but that is, how do we make improvements in this company? What problem solving method are we all using? Okay. What toolkit do we have to execute this problem solving? Absolutely. We do need to be speaking the same language in all of those ways, as well as what metrics we're using. How do we know we're actually improving? All of that, yes. And it is important within the company to do that. But it's not important to say, oh, well, Toyota does this and Toyota is great, so we must do it exactly the way they do it, or we're wrong. You'll say, yeah, that is wrong. Well, I don't know.
Yeah.
Why is it a matter of right and wrong? It's not, I don't see it that way, because I've seen successes using different terminologies and different tools, and that's fine. As the commonality, like I said, is having this consistent problem-solving process, having the right culture. And one thing I didn't mention is having true leadership engagement, not just lip service to it, but actual ownership of this. So it's not thought of as something off to the side. That's one of the pitfalls, I think. When we think of operational excellence as something out here, it's not, not core to the company, but really it has to be part of our DNA if we're going to be successful.
Yeah, I think the ideal state of every company that goes down this path or pursues this path. Of course, I hear mantras like every person, every day, all the time. Like, I think that's one interesting where you talk about Toyota, and I think people hear like, oh, Toyota doesn't have a central CI function or something, so we must not need a central CI function. Because it's part of the water at Toyota, we can just expect it's going to be part of the water for us. I know you've been doing this for a long time. You said like 23 years. So you've probably seen a lot of different companies go through a lot of different cycles, a lot of different life cycles. Some of them where they were on a rocket ship and things just, got really well adopted. And then maybe others where programs have stuttered. I've seen a little bit of both. With AI right now, we're definitely in a period where everything is on the table, and like there's probably never been, I can't think of any time when there's been more change facing, the just processes in general. What are some of those patterns that you've seen where people kind of like have the missteps, like their improvement program starts to fall backwards instead of continue to progress.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And sometimes I'm called in to companies where that was the case. But the biggest commonality that I've seen, or the biggest factor, I should say, that I've seen that causes this sort of drop in improvement, or kind of reverting to the norm, you might even say, in some cases, it really is driven by leadership primarily. When leadership changes, a company gets purchased, very often you'll see that, a merger, and then it's like, "Oh, okay, now we still have this, it's over here, but it's not nearly as important, and we've kind of reverted back to our old way of doing things." So I think leadership is key. Now, a lot of times it is tied to the individual specific leaders, right? Because you could
Yeah.
replace a CEO or a COO that has a different mindset, a different way of thinking, and they may not value operational excellence as much. They may not eliminate it completely, but they kind of will put it off to the side. And that's where you'll see a lot of drop off. Now, in some cases, a company may make improvement that is driven purely by, say, a CI or an operational excellence group. And then I've seen things like, that group gets downsized, or they don't necessarily lay off those people, but they have them doing something else now. So very often it is tied to leadership, the leadership of the company, because if the leadership thinks of operational excellence as something that's just, it's important, but somebody else does that. I leave it to this group, right? We're not really involved except to maybe make a speech about it or tell
Yeah.
people it's important, but we don't do anything about it. If that's the mindset, it won't stick and it won't be very successful. The most successful um, experiences I've had over the 23 years with EMS Consulting Group, and even prior to that, working for another consulting company for 2 or 3 years prior to that. The real common thread is, how much ownership does leadership have in this? Do they really believe in it, encourage it? Are they directly involved in it, or not? And where, in cases where they are, they're going to be far more successful, because one of the things, and you may even be thinking about this now as I'm speaking, but knowing what you know, but one of the things that you might think about is, who should determine what the priorities are for operational excellence? What improvements should we be working toward? Well, that has to be determined at a high level, right, with strategy. And that has to be owned by the leadership team, not by operational excellence. And I have seen cases, in fact, even very recently, where I've had a CI team, someone I know very well for many years, that now works at this med device company. And she called me and said, "Well, what we want to do is we want to do X matrix for this company." And as we dug into it a little bit more, I kind of found out that that was just her group that wanted to do it, but leadership was sort of resistant to even doing it. So my advice is, we need to get leadership involved. Don't, having them, dragging them or begging them to come out and do this exercise is not going to be very effective. So it does hinge quite a bit on leadership in my experience.
That's such a good insight right there. That strikes me as something that I've probably made that same mistake as a leader many times, where you get something. I mean, it takes long enough to get people on the same page with what to do, particularly in a big company. In a small company, your department, you make a decision, you decide to do it, great. But there's this difference between communicating I guess I'd say, like, the what and the why, as opposed to the how. Like, hey, let's implement X matrix. Sounds kind of like a tactical thing, like, let's do this. But I think what you're picking up on is part of, your response to that is kind of reframing the question and adding the, why is this important?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I do that all the time with clients. I mean, that's one of the things that I generally just make part of my initial conversation with any client, because I want to understand, or potential client, because I want to understand what they're really after. Like, I'll have a client like that. That was a good example
Yeah.
with the X matrix. But another one recently, in the past couple of months, that I had contacted me and said, "We want value stream mapping, we think." You know, I said, okay, why do you think so? And as I learned more about the specific situation, just doing value stream mapping would not really solve their problem. It may be something that should be part of what they do, but it's not even the first thing I would do. They had a lot of operational problems and they were in the midst of trying to implement an ERP system, and it was very unsuccessful. They had spent 2 or 3 years really toying around with it, and it's just a bigger problem, right? So what's the business outcome that we want to achieve? It's not going to be solved by just doing, say, a value stream mapping workshop like they asked for. Once they understood that, they said, oh, okay, so what do you suggest we do? And then we talked more about it and figured out a plan. But very often you'll get, a client or a person will just think, I need this tool. Like maybe they heard about this
Yeah.
value stream mapping. Yeah, that's it. Let me call
Yeah.
an expert in value stream mapping and let me see if that will solve my problem. But really, I don't want to, as a consultant, and this is something that I even learned when I worked for another consulting company, very small company where I kind of learned the consulting
Yeah.
business, is that you really want to understand the business problem that they have, not sell a tool or a methodology necessarily. Right. So if they come to you with a question that's really asking about a tool, we want to implement S, for example, or we want to implement Kanban or something like that. I need to understand, why do you even say that? Right. And that goes back to something we might have talked about even in our first podcast, because one of the things I also encourage when we're teaching problem solving is to ask that very same question to understand why this is the problem to work on, right? You state this is the problem. What's the effect of that? Why is that important? Why are we solving that? So it's really kind of the same thing. It's all about questioning, having a questioning mind or a problem solving mind. And once you have that, I think you can be a lot more successful at anything,
Yeah.
but certainly at operational excellence.
As you were saying this, I was reminded of just some situations I've faced even recently related to the X Matrix. I love the X Matrix. I'm a huge fan of the X Matrix. We've done some previous podcasts on good ways to use the X Matrix. And in my experience, I've seen some kind of dysfunctional ways of using the X Matrix. When, again, my first introduction to the X Matrix, I thought for sure this was a conspiracy by the Chiropractors Association to create more kinked necks.
Right, because you've got things going in different
But
directions.
I saw one recently that literally looked like, I mean, it's huge. It's this huge map, and it looks like there's 50 things on there. And my question I wanted to ask to the right person, which when I first saw this one, I wasn't quite sure who the right person was because there was so much stuff on there, is, okay, which of these is most important? Like, if you could only have one thing on this list, what would it be? Is there a question or a set of questions that can help you get at what is most important? For example, like when I think of the persona of a lot of senior leaders, let's say CEO or CFO or COO, how much business improvement do we need this year? Just starting with a number of some kind, a measure of some kind. Are there some other like focusing questions or something that you like to use to help people figure out what is the most important problem to solve?
Well, I like to start with really what their business goals are at a high level. So what is it they're trying to achieve? A certain amount of growth, for example,
Mm,
very commonly, right? So I want to understand, like for example, I think I mentioned this, I may have mentioned this company, not the name, but that last year, one of my clients was in a new space for me, something I never had worked in before. And that was recycling, and it's recycling pre-consumer food, which is an interesting business where they take food from that's left over that didn't sell at
yeah,
supermarkets, Costco, things like that, and they
great.
recycle it. And I'm working directly with the CEO of this company. And basically, when I first met and understood, okay, what are the problems that you're trying to attack? What is it that you're trying to achieve? And for that company, it was really to try to become profitable. They were bought out, and the goal was, well, we're losing money. We have a lot of talent, we have a lot of capability, but we're not using it, and we want to become profitable. So we look at, well, where are the biggest levers of profitability, and what improvements will we need to make to achieve that? So part of it is to increase capacity, right? Which is a very common operational excellence kind of problem. So
Absolutely.
then we could say, okay, well, by how much do we need to increase capacity to meet your profitability goals, right? And then just that one goal of increasing capacity, we would look at the whole system, the whole flow, the value stream, if you will, right? And then in
Hmm.
there and say, okay, where do we need to apply this thinking? And then in terms of how we actually achieve that, because they were very successful, and I'm still doing a little bit with them, but they've succeeded quite a bit, and we're on to the next level of improvement. But basically, it was working on a number of different things like value stream mapping, like training some of their key leaders below the CEO to understand and practice problem solving. So they would own some of these improvements and they would actually follow the problem solving process. And by the end, the CEO was very impressed with his team on how they were conversant in the problem solving process. Now, I should say the CEO himself also had some, quite a bit of lean experience, and he really understood why this made sense. So it was an
Yeah.
easier sell in a way, right? To
Yeah.
someone that understands that. When someone doesn't really understand that, it's a little bit of a tougher sell. But for him, it was a slam dunk because he knew that would work.
I do think that's maybe an interesting point here to make for people that are listening to the pod here is that in some organizations, the idea of if you've been in an organization where green belts are trained well and they execute projects well, if you've ever worked with somebody who's just really good at something and your light bulb is like, okay, this person I worked with was really good, they're a green belt. I really don't want to work with anybody who doesn't have that skill set again on this kind of a problem. That's something that I've seen really does exist in plenty of organizations, right? Some organizations have this, I guess I'd say like testimony that this is a good way to teach problem solving and everybody should go through this. Because once you learn that language or that term, like if you just say green belt, some people will point out that there's lots of levels of what green belts can be. And not to say that every green belt is like an amazing problem solver, but if you've got somebody who at least has really done some green belt, you establish a rapport. There's a language, there's a thinking process that you already kind of like fast forward a lot of that, like, what you'd otherwise have to just take time building. So I think that's an interesting instance.
Yeah, and I've seen that work very well at a lot of clients over the years, right? And there have been some where I've trained a huge number of people, right? And they've really been able to make huge improvements over time because the way I do it, and I know we talked about this last time, is my goal for these types of trainings is to ensure that the students, that the participants can actually and do actually apply this regularly and really begin to think that way. So it's not just classroom training, it's really coaching them as well through these problem solving efforts and actually ensuring that they begin to think that same way and that there's more work for them to do
Hmm.
to follow up to practice it. So they don't just learn something and then don't do anything with it.
Kind of coming back to this idea of language and specific words, if training is the idea of like presenting some new information versus coaching, I kind of have in my head like, okay, training, like I can watch a video and I can quote be trained, but to receive coaching, I'm gonna get a little bit of more like feedback on my particular situation. I think that's how you're describing it, is in the moment on your problem statement. Give me some coaching.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. With coaching, the way I think of it is if I'm coaching someone, I'm trying to help them um, perform a certain behavior. And that a lot of times is problem solving thinking.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to increase their competency at a certain behavior or discipline. In this case, it would be problem solving.
Are you struggling to ignite real change in your continuous improvement program? Firestarter is your field guide. Real stories, proven strategies, no fluff. Get it now on Amazon. So Darren, I want to come back to this. We were talking about green belts and how projects get managed, and you said that in some companies there can be this like lack of enthusiasm around, let's just call it a belt program, people getting trained, when maybe somebody sends somebody off to training and they don't see like a huge ROI. Do you have any numbers that you'd be willing to throw out? Like what percent of the people that do their first greenbelt project have a positive ROI on that first project? Is it 100%? Probably less than 100 and
Well, I
more
don't
than
have an
0.
exact number on that, but it's close to that. I mean, it's close to that. Where it's not is the occasional dropout, a person that may start a program, right, with
Yeah.
a Greenbelt program with us, for example, and then they drop out. And that's where we don't have that often, but occasionally that does happen because of usually, again, you could kind of tie it back to leadership and things like that, where they'll say, this person just doesn't have time for this. Why I
Yeah.
want them doing this, or I want them, working on something else, and not allowing them to have the time to even execute. But in cases where they're actually going to execute a project, which is the vast majority of the time, they will get a positive ROI for sure because they're working on a relevant business problem, an important business problem. And one of the things that I encourage as well is to start the program. If you're looking to do a Greenbelt program, the first thing you would want to do is engage leadership in determining what the goals should be, right? Like, what business problems do we want them working on? What metrics, what key metrics should we be working toward, and targets should we be working toward? And then we can tailor the problem solving projects specifically toward those goals. So it's not just random, pick anything and make an improvement on it. But that involves engaging leadership, and sometimes that, recently I had a proposal for that for a med device client. And the couple of people that I was directly working with were really excited about it and said, yeah, this is exactly what we want to do. But it turned out that, someone higher up, a COO in the company, was like, nah, let's not do this right now. We're too busy. Maybe we can just do some e-learning or something like that. And it's like, well, then you're going to get the result like I talked about
Yeah.
earlier. Nothing wrong with e-learning. We have e-learning. But if you're just going to take a course and go through it and rubber stamp, hey, I've completed this course, it's not going to show business results. So why do it? Um, from that would be short-sighted in my view, certainly from someone at a high level like a COO type to say something.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting scenario because I think every company, every industry, every discipline, I'm even thinking like professional licensing organizations, right? Like maybe it's accounting or finance or medical profession where there's professional licensure involved. A lot of time they'll have continuing education requirements, right? Like that's an example of a very formal structure where somebody said, hey, every year, every 2 years, you need to have some amount of like learning and training. And it's very formal, right? Like you can't be licensed if you don't have that. Obviously, that's very formal. It's a lot of times government. Maybe that's not the best model. But I think the idea of having some carve out or some requirement or some space for that training is probably a good idea. Have you seen companies be successful with, I'm kind of imagining somebody like, I can even think of something that we did internally a few years ago where we bought access to this like learning platform and said, here it is, knock yourselves out. But there was no like structure, mandate, expectation. What is it that people could do if they actually really want to encourage people to engage with the training or the coaching?
Well, I always say it should be tied to specific improvements that you're going to work on. So what we would do is we have like an LMS platform that we use, and we can brand it for the client and things like that. But just giving them that is really not enough, because then it ends up potentially just like you described, right? Where people might take courses or not, but it's not formalized and they're not necessarily, tracking it in the sense that we want this number of people trained in this discipline, and here's why. So what we would do is we work with the client to come up with a plan. If you're going to do this, we call it our enterprise plan, but with the enterprise plan, we say, okay, what are your goals? What are you trying to achieve with this? So that we don't just offer you a bunch of courses and then do what you want with those. Instead, we'll work with you to determine, what should be the business goals, and then who should be taking what courses. And then they can even tie that into the requirements or sort of the improvement plans for the individual, right? So they say, well, we want these individuals trained in this discipline, and we want them to show some results in this discipline as a result of the training. So usually we encourage, a system like that and some combination of live coaching. Now, in some cases, it may be with us, but in other cases, it may be an internal person that does the training. We actually did that quite a bit with, you had him as a guest, Jesse
Oh,
Rendon,
yeah.
where we've done that exactly with him, where he was sort of the internal coach, but we provided the e-learning, and they had sort of a system where they went through, but they had some coaching. Because if it's just going through a course that's passive, or mostly
Yeah.
passive, that's not really going to be, in my view, it's not really that effective. And that's where AI can actually do the same thing, right? They can just go on AI and they can
Yeah.
ask questions and get some information. And information and having the tools available is great, but it's really the know-how in application and that problem solving discipline throughout that's really key, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think the thing that I'm picking up on your comments, and I think I'm an advocate of, is having some central accountability and ownership of this process. I'm reminded of a conversation I had many years ago with somebody that I worked with, and he was inside of a big company, and we were working on some projects together, and he was kind of annoyed with the fact that he had to go and do a report for the executives. And his comment was like, "Look, do you want me to do the work, or do you want me to report on the work? Because I only have time to do one." And I think that's kind of the scenario that a lot of people find themselves in. And, when we are capacity constraint with our own time, a lot of people would default to just do the work. But I think that there is a very important cultural element in some of the formal rituals. I mean, I hate to make it sound like it's not value add activity. I think it is value add activity. And I think part of the value add activity is sharing those insights and that process with other people in the organization from that continuous learning. I mean, one of the things that I've seen, even in our own company recently, we've been carving time out to make time for AI shares on a weekly basis. So we just have a small amount of time. It's part of an existing meeting where we ask people to share just, something that they learned from AI, either something they did themselves or something that they saw, and just making space for that learning. It's kind of unstructured time. We're not telling them what to go learn. We're not passing lessons. We're just making space for it. And the amount of innovation and ideas that are coming from that has been really powerful. I'm curious if you have any examples of successful behaviors that, whether it's you as a consultant or an internal CI function, or maybe working together, where there's certain rituals that can help keep that CI culture healthy when in a scenario like that.
I would say one of the biggest things that I've seen that's effective is the interfacing with the leadership. So you may have systems in place like daily management, for example, right? Where you have certain metrics and targets that you're tracking, and your CI team is supposed to be supporting this in the sense that they're giving the tools and they're facilitating, they're doing these sorts of things to help the individual departments and functions meet those goals, right? But where does leadership interface in with this, right? How involved is leadership in that process? And I've found that the most successful CI teams actually have very significant leadership interaction and support. So they're meeting with regularly the leadership team to make sure that they're actually working on the right things. And in order for that to work, the leadership team has to believe in it and own it, in a sense, own the operational improvements, where the CI team should really be sort of the facilitator. That's how I view them. They should be sort of the internal teachers, facilitators, so that they're just supporting what leadership wants. And like I said earlier, the wrong model is for them to just be off to the side. They own the improvement, but they don't have enough authority to actually make it stick, make it happen over time, because the leadership doesn't typically, in that case, they wouldn't care enough about it, to put it bluntly. They just don't value it.
Are there specific, let's say we're putting together, we're the central CI function for a big company, multiple sites, and we're trying to put together some leader standard work to say, look, you got to do more than just check the box, but here are the boxes we want you to check.
Right.
What would be the things that we want the leaders to show up? Are there hey, periodically, some number of days a week or month, show up to the huddle, or show up to a project report out or a stage gate review? Like, what are some of those things that you would say, again, not that checking the box is enough, but what are the
Right.
boxes the leader should check to
What should it include?
Yeah.
Well, I would flip that a little bit in the sense that what I encourage is for the leadership team to actually develop their own leader standard work, whether you want to call it that or not. Now, I know I've seen some debates as should we call it that because leaders don't like it. To me, it doesn't matter, but for lack of a better term, we'll call it that. They should work to develop that in conjunction with CI, and I've worked with leadership teams to develop this where they own it. Because the worst thing is, and I have seen this as well, where the CI team comes up with this routine and says, okay, here's what you guys are going to do. And they give it and kind of do a presentation for the leadership team. And they say, here's what we want you to do. And that is usually very poorly received. So, and I understand why, because you're kind of creating it for them and
Yeah.
saying, okay, now you do this. And they don't really even understand why they need to do it. They don't see the value in it.
Could you just explain what leader standard work is?
Say, first of all, what is standard work? I mean, that's a lean or operational excellence term that we use a lot. And in general, those are sort of routines for our best practices to achieve a certain um, customer output, right? So if we're building product, we have standard work for assembling our ABC widget or something, right? And that includes, a number of different steps that we do. And we do that routinely within a certain time frame, which we would call tack time to meet customer demand. We get one product out every minute. That's our goal to meet the 60 an hour demand that we have, right? So that's standard work. Now, when we talk about leader standard work, it's not quite like that, but it still is a routine. It's basically saying, what is the leadership routine that they should be doing every day? And maybe some things are weekly, but every day, what should they be doing? And you hinted at some of the activities that might be on there. For example, the supervisor is going to might lead some sort of daily huddle at a specific cell, let's say a production or an assembly cell or something like that. But then a higher level leader, like a GM or a plant manager, may attend some of those, but he or she may also have another like higher level huddle. And we call these kind of tiered
Okay.
huddles, right? Where you have different levels, where we're looking at the next level, say, of metrics and targets, and where we're off target, that's part of our daily management. We want to start working on solving those problems, highlighting those reds, those things that are not meeting the goal and not meeting the goal repeatedly so that we can attack that. And that's where problem solving comes in. So why do we want leadership engaged? Because leadership is responsible for the highest level goals of the organization and the highest level measurements like profitability and things like that. That's what they're responsible for. So we want them directly engaged in all of the other activities that are supporting that. Because if you were to say, we need to improve profitability, right? That's super high level. We need to understand what are the levers of profitability. Well, presumably at each one of these departments and functions, we have, if we did it right, our metrics and our goals, our KPIs, right, should be tied to those higher level goals of the organization. And we want leadership engaged. And culturally, we also want leadership engaged because we want to send the message to people that, yes, this is very important. But for all of that to work, the leaders need to buy into this. And so if the process for that is the CI group says, here's some sheets that explain to you what you need to do every day, and just check these boxes and turn them into us or something like that, which I have seen, typically doesn't work. But again, it's very much tied into what do the leadership believe? What does the leadership team actually believe about operational excellence? Do they believe it's part of our DNA? It's what we do, which is what it should be? Or do they think it's just this thing off to the side and we can,
Yeah.
those CI guys can do that, that group can handle it. If they think of it that way, that will not work,
Yeah.
And there may be different reasons why they think that way. I've read different things. I know you had the great Professor Bob Emiliani on, and I know he's way above my pay grade on those sorts of things for sure, because I know he studied that, whether there's, it's deep rooted in history or what. But I have found some leaders, and those are the ones I like to work with, that really do believe in this, and we can be successful. But there are others that don't, that don't engage in that same way. And I think you're not going to be able, if you're a CI group there, you will be frustrated in that case.
That's an interesting one. And I think maybe what you're getting at is, and I don't know how often in companies, if you've got a CI team that's introducing some of this stuff, they might be going around like teaching managers how to do this stuff. If it's the CI person that's having to lead all of those, I don't know, like why isn't the manager leading those daily huddles with owning the metrics and stuff?
Right. And
Yeah.
that's sometimes where I can be helpful,
Yeah.
because as a CI group or CI manager,
Hmm.
there are political issues, company politics,
Yeah.
where it's difficult for them to kind of turn to a higher level leader in the organization and say, you're wrong, or we need to do this, or kind of push back on them a little bit. Whereas if I usually I'm brought in by a leadership team rather than a CI group. Sometimes I am brought in by CI groups as well, but generally from a higher level manager in the organization, like an operations
Yeah.
VP or a COO or something. And I can actually mediate and get this thing to work correctly, because simply because I'm on the outside and I can tell the COO the truth. Not that CI leaders aren't telling the truth, but they have to be careful with
Yeah.
with their position and the company politics and all of this stuff, which I don't get involved in. One of the reasons I love being in the consulting business is I don't need to get directly involved in any of that stuff.
Yeah, this topic of standard work, I know hopefully most folks know what standard work is. I think there's probably plenty that don't really know what it is and don't really exactly know what it looks like. And we've got some resources on our website in KPI Fire for some templates. But if we were to try to describe what standard work looked like for somebody that wasn't quite sure, how might you describe it? Like I've seen sometimes people have like a paper checklist almost that has like, here's what you do daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly kind of stuff. Sometimes it's in a calendar. What are some of the different ways you've seen standard work manifest in companies over the years?
I think is the standard work chart to the leader standard work, because you mentioned kind of like um, the step-by-step routine that you might do.
Yeah.
So for like standard work for an assembly process, it's going to have all the steps and the times and a picture of how that, what that looks like potentially on a layout and that sort of thing. Now for a leader standard work, a lot of times it is like a calendar or like a checklist or an Excel checklist that kind of shows, here are all the things, the activities that we want you to do and when. So like morning startup, or I've seen more general ones that don't have the when. Like in other words, they don't have specific times like 8 a.m., 8:15, 8:30. Either way, the important thing is that they're actually following that routine, right? So they, like, for example, you might have a daily Gemba walk, right?
Yeah.
As part of your routine where you walk around to each area. And again, there's also different definitions
Hmm.
of what that should be. I don't want to go too deep into it, but it might be in one case, right? It might be walking to each functional area. Like I had a client where what we did is we had the leadership team when they first started doing this, and they continue to do this. They go to each area, shipping, receiving, different production areas, things like that. Each one of these areas has their own daily management board with their metrics and targets and what they're working on, right? They had their daily huddle. And the leadership team can walk around and look at that and interface with the supervisor of that area and understand what their priorities are, whether they need some help to maybe break down some barriers that they might have in achieving their goals. But they had a good sense of the pulse of the organization by doing that. So that might be one activity that the leader standard work would have, so that the leaders understand what's going on and how they can support it. Because what leadership should be doing, obviously, right, is thinking, how do I support these operations. Now, why? Because very obviously, if they want to reach their goals, and the frontline organizations, parts of the organization are working toward their goals, if they're tied correctly, they're going to meet their goals, right? So if you free up production to meet their goals, then and shipping to meet their goals and receiving to meet their goals, then you will reach those financial goals that the organization is going to be evaluating you
Yeah.
on, right? So there's a lot of reasons to do this. But if it's not explained that way and they don't see it, then it's more like, here's a set of tasks for you to do.
Yeah.
And that's why it's better to have them develop it, actually engage them in developing it rather than giving it to them.
Yeah, it's again, I love this topic of language and where some of these things come from, because of course there's like the Lean Six Sigma, there's a Japanese, there's also, I think it was the book Atomic Habits, which is a super popular book, and the quote or the mantra goes something like this: we don't rise to the level of our goals, we fall to the level of our systems. And I think
That's a good
leadership
quote.
standard work is like the system for a leader. Like, yes, you can have a goal, but a system is like, what are the things that you do each day, each week, each month? And are there some, I'm kind of picturing this, and maybe this is from previous experience. If you go to some people and you say, hey, we want you to make a list of the things that you do every day, the resistance is like, well, I don't know. All my days are different. They're all so different. I couldn't possibly write that down. You mentioned Gemba walk. Like, Gemba walk is something that's very commonly taught and also reminded. I think that's one of the things I probably hear the most of leaders who just remind themselves and others the value of go and see where the work is done, what it's like to work with your company. That show Undercover Boss, I think that's the lesson that happens every single time in that show, where they have the CEO go, work the front lines, and every single time it's like, oh my gosh, I had no idea this thing was happening. How could we let this happen?
Right. Absolutely. One of the greatest leaders I've worked with personally as a client, when the first time I worked with him, he took over as VP of operations at that time. And one of the first things he did was go out to the front lines of the organization. And that required actually gowning. It was a clean room operation. And he was there very often. And when I interfaced with the frontline people as well, they were telling me, because I didn't know the previous VP of ops, what a difference this was. It's like, this guy really cares. And he was, taking an interest and understanding how things worked. And we actually made so many improvements in that organization, but it wouldn't have been possible without that sort of thinking and having a leader that really had understood the importance of interfacing with the front line, and interfacing with everybody in the organization, and not kind of just managing by the numbers up in the office sort of a thing. So yeah, Undercover Boss is a great example of that. It's a great show for that kind of
I
thing.
bet
It's
every
very
CEO
wonderful.
that signs up for that probably thinks, oh yeah, I'm going to be the one who's different. I'm going to be the one who doesn't find anything rotten going
Yeah,
on in my company, right? They're
right. They
always just
probably think everything's good, and then they're
That's
surprised. Yeah.
probably a good mirror on leadership in general. Because I mean, I've never met a CEO, a leader at a big company like that doesn't genuinely care about the experience. And I think there's so many of us that know what we should do, and for whatever reasons, we get into our habits, we get into our routines, we think that it's being taken care of, we make assumptions, and God, there's so many of those lessons that just are such good teachers, like you just shared. Well, Darren, thank you so much for being with us again here today. Do you want to share a website or tell folks how they can get in touch with you?
Well, you can find me personally on LinkedIn. You can also visit our website, our company website at emsstrategies.com, and, shoot me an email or a message on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to answer any questions about this, what I've said here, or any other topic.
Awesome.
It was a pleasure. I enjoyed being on a second time.
Absolutely.
So
It's a
it
lot of
was
fun.
great.
I enjoy our chats so
Yeah.
much. Thanks so much, Darren.
All right. Thanks a lot, Keith.
And for our listeners, if you would like to get in touch, suggest a guest, ask a question, you can reach out to me on the KPI Fire website or on LinkedIn. And I'm Keith C. Norris on LinkedIn. And this concludes this episode of KPI Fireside, a continuous improvement podcast. If you have enjoyed the episode, please be sure to add a comment, like, follow, subscribe on the socials. You can share the podcast with friends or colleagues who are as passionate about continuous improvement as you are. You can find us wherever you get your podcast. And until next time, Keep driving progress and sparking change. This episode is brought to you by KPI Fire, the all-in-one platform for continuous improvement. With KPI Fire, you can align strategy, drive execution, and engage your people. So whether you're leading a team or driving enterprise-wide change, KPI Fire helps you deliver real results. Learn more at www.kpifire.com.